By 1944, soldiers across Europe were being searched for weapons they were never supposed to carry. Military regulations were clear: issued equipment only, no concealed blades, no non-regulation weapons. Anything outside official supply could be confiscated or used as evidence of intent. But regulations written far from the front rarely survived close combat. Men fighting at night, behind enemy lines, or in occupied territory carried knives that made commanders uncomfortable and enemies suspicious. Some violated military discipline. Some marked their carriers as assassins if captured. And some increased the risk of execution simply by being found. These were not knives banned by one global law. These are the 10 knives soldiers kept anyway. Number 10. Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife. The knife that erased the rules. This was the blade that rewrote close combat and made every enemy question whether the man holding it was a soldier or something else entirely. The Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife was designed in 1940 by two men who had spent decades learning how people actually killed each other. William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes had served in the Shanghai Municipal Police during some of the most violent years of the 20th century. They had studied knife wounds. They had documented fatal stabbings. They knew what worked in alleys, in doorways, in the space where a second's hesitation meant death. The knife they created was not a tool. It was a weapon built for one purpose: silent killing. Double-edged, needle-pointed, balanced for a killing thrust, the Fairbairn Sykes knife became the official sidearm of British commandos, the Special Air Service, and covert units across the Allied forces. Its distinctive shape became synonymous with the new breed of warrior emerging from Britain's Special Operations community. But its very design created a problem that no one discussed openly. Military regulations in multiple armies restricted the carrying of double-edged blades. Such weapons were considered excessive, the mark of a man looking to kill, not merely defend himself. International perceptions held that purpose-built killing knives placed their carriers outside the normal protections of war. Commandos understood this. Their training emphasized that capture was unlikely to end well regardless, but the Fairbairn Sykes knife made it worse. German standing orders in certain theaters classified captured commandos carrying assassination-style weapons as eligible for immediate execution under Hitler's Commando Order of 1942. Yet soldiers kept carrying it, because in a night raid, in a sentry elimination, in the brutal silence of close-quarters killing, nothing else came close. The Fairbairn Sykes did not just change commando doctrine. It announced a new kind of warfare, one where rules meant less than results, and survival justified any blade that achieved it. And the next knife on this list pushed that logic even further. Number 9. V-42 Stiletto. Designed to kill faster than silence. The V-42 was not built for soldiers who expected to be captured. It was built for soldiers who expected to kill before anyone knew they were there. Developed for the 1st Special Service Force, the Joint American and Canadian unit known as the Devil's Brigade, the V-42 Stiletto was purpose-designed for silent elimination. Its blade was narrow, double-edged, and sharpened to a needlepoint. Its handle was wrapped in leather and fitted with a skull-crusher pommel for strikes when the blade could not be used. The unit's mission profile told the rest of the story. The Devil's Brigade conducted night raids, mountain assaults, and operations behind enemy lines where silence was survival. The V-42 was their signature, a weapon as distinctive as the unit itself. But that distinctiveness carried risk. German forces on the Italian front came to recognize the blade. Reports circulated describing captured V-42s and the men who carried them. The knife's design, purely offensive, offering no utility beyond killing, reinforced perceptions that its carriers were not ordinary combatants. Under the Commando Order, German commanders had authority to execute captured commandos and special operations troops without trial. The V-42's unmistakable profile made its owners easy to identify and easier to condemn. Soldiers knew this. They trained with the knife anyway. They killed with it. They carried it into operations where surrender was not a realistic option. Because when you moved through occupied territory in darkness, the V-42 was not just a weapon. It was insurance that you would never need to test whether the enemy intended to follow the rules. As we go through this list, I'm curious, which of these would you have been most afraid to be caught carrying so far? Number 8. OSS Stiletto. If you carried this, you weren't a soldier anymore. The Office of Strategic Services did not issue standard infantry equipment. It issued tools for a shadow war. The OSS Stiletto was one of those tools, a thin, double-edged blade designed for clandestine operatives working behind enemy lines. Unlike the Fairbairn Sykes or the V-42, this knife was not part of any official military supply chain. It was covert equipment distributed through intelligence channels to agents who operated outside the normal structures of war. Carrying an OSS Stiletto was an acknowledgement of what you were, not a uniformed combatant protected by international convention. A spy, a saboteur, a man whose capture meant interrogation, not imprisonment. The knife itself reflected that reality. Lightweight, concealable, and built purely for killing, it offered no pretense of utility. It could not cut rope. It could not open rations. It existed to enter a human body and end a life. German counterintelligence services understood this. So did the Gestapo. An operative caught with an OSS Stiletto would not be handed over to military authorities for processing as a prisoner of war. He would be held, questioned, and disposed of according to procedures that existed outside any published regulation. For the men who carried it, the stiletto was a calculated risk. They accepted that capture meant death regardless of what they carried. So they carried the blade most likely to prevent capture in the first place. It was a knife for men who had already accepted that the rules no longer applied to them. Number 7. British lapel dagger. The weapon no one was supposed to find. Some knives were hidden in boots. Some were strapped to belts or tucked into pockets. The British lapel dagger was hidden in plain sight, sewn into the collar of a jacket, pressed flat against the chest, invisible to any search that did not strip a man to his skin. Issued by the Special Operations Executive to agents operating in occupied Europe, the lapel dagger was not a battlefield weapon. It was an insurance policy, a last resort. A blade so small and so well concealed that its discovery required either extraordinary luck or the kind of thorough interrogation that meant the mission had already failed. Its purpose was simple. If an agent was captured and bound, if all other options had been exhausted, the dagger could be reached, extracted, and used, either to cut restraints, to attack a captor, or to ensure that certain information would never be revealed. The knife's existence was classified. Its distribution was limited to operatives whose missions placed them in the highest risk categories. Being caught with one was proof of espionage, and the consequences of that proof were absolute. Nazi security services did not treat captured spies as prisoners. They treated them as enemies to be broken and destroyed. A lapel dagger found during interrogation would confirm every suspicion and end any hope of survival. Yet agents requested them. They understood that in the worst moment, the blade offered a choice that captivity did not. It was the weapon no one was supposed to find, because finding it meant everything else had already gone wrong. Number 6. The German gravity knife, Fallschirmjäger, a tool that could get you executed. The German gravity knife was not designed as a weapon. It was designed as a survival tool, issued to Fallschirmjäger paratroopers so they could cut themselves free from tangled parachute lines after landing. But design and perception are different things. To Allied forces, the gravity knife looked like an offensive weapon. Its blade deployed with a flick of the wrist, fast, silent, and unmistakably aggressive. Captured German paratroopers carrying gravity knives were sometimes treated with suspicion that exceeded their actual threat. The real danger, however, came from a different direction. Within the German military, regulations governed what soldiers could carry and when. The gravity knife was standard issue for parachute troops, but possession by non-authorized personnel was a disciplinary offense. Soldiers from other branches who acquired gravity knives through barter, battlefield recovery, or theft risked punishment from their own command structure. More serious were the implications of capture. Allied forces did not always distinguish between standard-issue tools and concealed weapons. A gravity knife found on an infantryman rather than a paratrooper could raise questions about how he acquired it and what he intended to do with it. In the confusion of close combat, those questions could mean the difference between prisoner of war status and summary treatment. German soldiers who carried gravity knives outside their authorized role understood the risk. They carried them anyway because a fast blade was worth more than regulations when the fighting turned desperate. The next entry pushed that desperation even further, to a weapon so brutal it had been condemned a generation earlier. Up to this point, which feels more dangerous, a knife that was hidden or one that was officially issued but carried the wrong reputation? Number 5. Brass knuckle trench knife, so brutal even armies backed away. Before the Second World War, there was another war that rewrote the rules of close combat. The weapons from that conflict did not disappear when the armistice was signed. The brass knuckle trench knife, the American M, 1918, the French nail knives, and the improvised spiked knuckle dusters were designed for the trenches of 1914 to 1918. They were not elegant, they were not subtle, they were instruments of intimate violence, built for moments when soldiers fought in mud and darkness with nothing between them but desperation and the will to survive. By the 1930s, military authorities in multiple nations had distanced themselves from such weapons. They were seen as excessive, relics of a more brutal age that modern armies preferred not to acknowledge. Formal regulations discouraged their issue and their carry. The weapons were not banned outright, but they were quietly pushed aside, replaced by cleaner designs that did not carry the same associations. But soldiers remembered. Veterans remembered what had worked in the trenches. When the Second World War began, men who had served in the first conflict still possessed trench knives from the previous war. Some were passed down within families. Others were recovered from surplus stores, private sales, or the forgotten corners of military warehouses where equipment from 1918 had gathered dust for 2 decades. Men carried them into the new war, not because they were issued, but because they knew what worked. The problem was perception. Brass knuckle weapons were viewed by many, including enemy forces, as tools of murder rather than combat. A soldier captured with a knuckle duster blade faced the accusation that he was not a lawful combatant, but a man who had chosen to fight like a criminal. In the brutal mathematics of capture, that accusation could be fatal. Yet soldiers kept these weapons anyway, hidden, unauthorized, and ready for the moments when survival mattered more than how you survived. The next blade required no family heirloom. It required only a boot and a willingness to disappear. Number 4, boot-concealed daggers, hidden weapons, immediate guilt. Across every major army of the Second World War, soldiers hid knives in their boots. The practice was not officially sanctioned. In most cases, it was explicitly forbidden. Military regulations required that weapons be carried openly, subject to inspection, and accounted for in unit inventories. A knife hidden in a boot existed outside that system, invisible, unaccountable, and impossible to explain as anything other than a tool for killing without warning. The designs varied. Some were commercially produced push daggers or stilettos acquired before deployment. Others were improvised, sharpened metal fitted with wrapped handles and concealed in custom-sewn sheaths. Many were simply standard-issue blades removed from their proper locations and relocated to where they could not be found. The logic was identical in every case. A visible knife could be confiscated. A hidden knife could not. But concealment carried consequences. Soldiers captured with hidden weapons faced immediate suspicion. The act of concealment implied intent, not just to fight, but to fight in a manner the enemy could interpret as treacherous. A man with a boot knife was not a prisoner who had surrendered in good faith. He was a man who had hidden a weapon, and the enemy had to decide whether that man could be trusted or should be eliminated. In many documented cases, the discovery of a concealed blade ended the possibility of prisoner status entirely. Soldiers accepted this. They hid the knives anyway, because a blade that no one knew about could still be used, and in the final moments before capture, that possibility was worth more than any regulation. Number 3. British Home Guard piking knives. The last stand weapon they didn't want seen. In 1940, Britain faced invasion. The regular army had been shattered at Dunkirk. Equipment was scarce. The Home Guard, a civilian defense force of veterans, factory workers, and men too old for conscription, needed weapons, and the War Office had almost none to give. So they improvised. Among the weapons issued to Home Guard units were piking knives, long spear-pointed blades mounted on poles, designed for close combat against paratroopers, infiltrators, and armored vehicles whose crews could be reached through vision slits. These were not subtle weapons. They were medieval in concept and brutal in application, designed for a last stand on British soil against an enemy that had conquered Europe. But the government did not want them seen. Public morale depended on the appearance of preparedness. Photographs of Home Guard units drilling with pikes and bayonet-mounted poles undermined that appearance. They revealed the desperation behind the propaganda, the reality that Britain was arming its citizens with improvised polearms because rifles did not exist in sufficient numbers. Official guidance discouraged documentation. Units were instructed to focus training on more modern equipment when possible. The piking knives existed, were distributed, and were quietly forgotten as better weapons eventually arrived. Yet for those critical months, men carried them. They trained to kill with them. They prepared to use them against an invasion that never came. The piking knife was Britain's admission of how close it had come, and a weapon the government never wanted the world to see. Number 2. Private purchase. Commando, knives carried against orders, kept for survival. Not every commando trusted the knife his army gave him. Some bought their own. Throughout the war, soldiers with access to funds and leave purchased fighting knives from civilian sources, high-quality blades from custom makers, antique dealers, and sporting goods stores. These private purchase knives were not part of any official inventory. They appeared on no equipment list. They existed because the men who carried them believed standard issue blades were not enough. Military regulations in most armies prohibited or restricted the carrying of non-regulation weapons. Commanding officers could confiscate unauthorized equipment. Discipline could be imposed. In some units, private purchase knives were grounds for formal punishment. Soldiers hid them anyway. The reasoning was brutally practical. Standard issue knives were designed for mass production and general utility. They were adequate for opening crates and cutting rope. They were not always adequate for killing a sentry in silence or fighting through a close quarters ambush. A privately purchased blade, sharper, better balanced, designed by a craftsman rather than a committee, could mean the difference between survival and failure. For commandos and special operations troops, the calculation was simple. The risk of discipline was real but survivable. The risk of inadequate equipment was often fatal, so they carried the knives their officers told them to leave behind. They paid for quality their armies would not provide, and they kept those blades hidden until the moment they were needed. It was disobedience in service of survival, and a reminder that soldiers trust their own judgment when regulations fail. The final entry needed no purchase at all. It needed only desperation and steel. At this point, do you think any of these rules actually survived combat, or were they always going to collapse once fighting turned personal? Number 1. Improvised combat knives. When rules failed, this is what men made. In every theater of the Second World War, soldiers built their own knives. From sharpened files to bayonets ground into stilettos, from vehicle springs hammered into blades to aircraft aluminum shaped into handles. Improvised combat knives were as varied as the men who made them and the materials they could find. These weapons existed outside every regulation ever written. They were not issued. They were not inspected. They carried no markings, no serial numbers, no connection to any official supply chain. A soldier caught with an improvised blade possessed something that could not be explained away as standard equipment. It was proof of premeditation, evidence that he had deliberately created a weapon to kill. The consequences of that proof depended entirely on who found it. In some cases, improvised knives were tolerated or ignored by commanding officers who understood why men made them. In others, discovery resulted in punishment. And in capture, an improvised blade could be interpreted as the weapon of a saboteur, a partisan, or a criminal, none of which guaranteed treatment as a lawful combatant. Yet soldiers kept building them. Because when ammunition ran out, when issued knives broke, when the fighting turned so close that only steel decided who lived, a man with an improvised blade had something a man without one did not. He had a chance. The improvised combat knife was the final answer to every failure of supply, every shortage of equipment, every regulation that did not survive contact with reality. It was what men made when everything else fell apart. These 10 knives tell a story that no official history wants to admit. The Second World War was not fought by soldiers who followed every rule, obeyed every regulation, and carried only what their quartermaster issued. It was fought by men who understood that survival often required weapons their own armies forbade, and their enemies would punish. Every blade on this list existed in the space between doctrine and desperation, carried by soldiers who calculated the risk of possession against the risk of being unarmed when the moment came. Some were forbidden by military regulation. Some were condemned by enemy perception. Some carried consequences that could mean execution rather than imprisonment. And some existed so far outside official channels that their very possession was an admission of guilt no explanation could erase. And all of them were carried anyway. Because in the end, the men who survived were not always the men who followed orders. They were the men who brought the blade that worked, regardless of what anyone said about carrying it. That is what these knives reveal. Not the nobility of war, but its arithmetic. Not the glory of combat, but the decisions made in darkness, in silence, in the space between rules and reality, where only outcomes mattered. The regulations said one thing. The soldiers did another. And the knives they kept, hidden in boots, sewn into collars, sharpened from scrap metal in quiet moments before the next operation, tell us which choice mattered more when the fighting started and the rules fell away. This was the truth they never wanted you to see. If you want more videos about the weapons, rules, and realities of war that do not usually make it into official histories, subscribe.